The valley greeted Mara with a silence so deep it felt like a blessing. Tall pines framed the meadow in a protective ring, their needles whispering in the wind like a welcome. Beyond them, mountain peaks stood watch. Strong and steady, exactly the kind of place she imagined building a new life for herself and the child she carried. Mara stepped down from the small wagon she had rented in the nearest town. Her hand went instinctively to her rounded belly, feeling the faint stirrings of the baby within. "We're here," she murmured. She wasn't running from anything and wasn't hiding from anyone. She simply wanted a peaceful beginning, one she could shape with her own hands. A life built slowly, honestly, log by log. Day by day she surveyed the meadow where soft grass rolled like a green quilt beneath the late summer sun. The land was exactly what she had hoped for, gentle, fertile, and close to a clear stream that wound like a ribbon through the valley. She could already imagine laundry lines fluttering in the wind, a small garden by the front door, and a cradle near the fireplace. Her home with determination warming her chest. Mara began unloading the tools she brought: an axe, a handsaw, a hammer, a rope, and a bucket of nails. None of these items were new, but they were reliable, and she had learned enough from watching carpenters back home to understand the basics of raising a small cabin. Her first job was marking out the structure. She walked the ground carefully, counting steps, measuring with twine, and arranging stones to outline the foundation. It felt almost ceremonial, like placing the first note of a song she would spend weeks learning to play. Then came the trees. Valley offered plenty of tall, straight pines, perfect for cabin logs. Mara chose the ones closest to the build site, not wanting to drag wood farther than necessary. Cutting them was slow work. She paused often, catching her breath and bracing her back against the ache. But each time she rested, she placed her palm on her stomach and whispered to the baby, "We're doing this together." By midday, sweat trickled down her spine and her arms trembled from effort. Still, a quiet pride steadied her. She worked the afternoon away, sawing sections of trunk, trimming branches, and stacking the logs in neat rows. The scent of fresh sap and warm pine filled the air, a comforting smell that wrapped around her like encouragement. She wasn't alone. Though she didn't know it, high on the ridge to the west, a tall, quiet-eyed cowboy sat on his horse, watching her with a mixture of admiration and wonder. Callum had noticed her arrival earlier that morning while riding his fence line. At first, he thought she might be a traveler passing through or someone visiting family. But when he saw her measuring land and cutting trees, herself pregnant, determined, and unflinching, something in his chest tightened: respect, curiosity, and a faint, unexpected warmth, like sunlight returning after a long winter. He kept his distance, not wanting to intrude. Instead, he observed silently, appreciating the steadiness in her movements, the way she paused to wipe her forehead, the way she smiled to herself each time she completed a task. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know her story, but already he felt drawn to the quiet strength she wore like a second skin. Down in the valley, Mara set the final beam of the day onto her growing stack and stepped back to look at her progress. It wasn't much yet: a few logs, an outline on the ground, a dream taking shape, but to her, it was everything. She had no idea that someone on the ridge watched with a heart stirring back to life. No idea destiny had already begun to write both their stories into the same meadow. Just a woman, her baby, and the beginning of a home. Callum had never considered himself a man easily surprised, but watching Mara changed that. Each dawn, when he rode out to check his cattle or mend a fence line, his eyes drifted toward the valley floor, where her unfinished cabin stood like a new heartbeat in the landscape. Every day he expected to see her resting or taking things slowly. After all, she was expecting a child. But every day she proved him wrong. Mara greeted the morning with a steadiness he admired. Before the sun cleared the mountains, she was already stacking logs, smoothing bark, or rolling stones to reinforce the foundation. She moved with purpose, not rushing, not pushing recklessly, but with a quiet determination that came from knowing exactly what she wanted her future to look like. Callum found himself drawn to that clarity. At first, he kept a respectful distance. He didn't want to approach too soon or make her uneasy. Folks in the frontier valued their privacy, and a pregnant woman building her own cabin likely valued it more than most. Still, something inside him resisted riding away. There was a gentleness about her that softened him without warning. Her strength wasn't loud or showy, it was patient, steady, and quietly radiant. It reminded him of spring seeds pushing through snow, choosing hope simply by growing. He told himself he wasn't watching her, just keeping an eye out in case she needed help. Ranchers were neighborly, after all. But he knew the truth. Each morning he found his gaze drifting toward her before he even realized it. One day, he noticed her struggling with a long beam. She wasn't in danger exactly, but every instinct in him urged him to ride down and help. Yet he held back. She deserved the chance to build this life on her own terms. So instead of interfering, he made a decision. He'd help her without her ever having to ask. That evening, after finishing his chores, he returned under the fading orange sky and quietly walked the edge of the tree line near her site. She wasn't there. She must have gone back to her wagon or bedroll to rest. The silence was peaceful, broken only by the flutter of meadowbirds settling into their nests. He studied the logs she planned to use the next day and noticed a few that were too heavy for her to lift alone, so he lifted them for her. Callum rolled them closer, setting them beside the foundation she had marked. He didn't stack them for her, that felt too intrusive, but he placed them in a way that made her morning easier. He also cleared some scattered rocks from the walking path, smoothing the ground so she wouldn't trip while carrying supplies. Then, before leaving, he studied the pile of firewood near her worksite. It wasn't much, just enough for cooking and keeping warm at night without thinking too hard. He fetched his axe and split a neat stack of logs, arranging them near the edge of her clearing. Not enough to alarm her, but enough to help. The next morning, from his vantage point on the ridge, he saw her pause. Mara stared at the moved logs, the cleared path, and the neatly split firewood. She looked around the meadow as if hoping to spot her silent helper. When she didn't, she simply smiled, soft, grateful, almost amused, and placed a hand on her belly. "Someone's looking out for us," she whispered. Callum felt warmth rise in his chest. He wasn't seeking thanks or recognition. Just knowing she felt safer, supported even by an anonymous hand, was enough. Day by day, his small axe continued. A log moved here, a stone rolled aside there, a tool left in easier reach. He never went too far, never touched anything personal, never imposed. It was simply his way of being present without intruding, and with each quiet act, his admiration deepened, not because she needed help, but because she accepted it with grace while still standing firmly on her own 2 feet. She didn't know him yet. He barely knew her, but already something wordless had begun to grow. By the time a week had passed, Mara had grown used to the small signs that someone was helping her. She still wasn't sure who it was, but she no longer felt uneasy about it. Whoever the mysterious helper was, he had a respectful hand, never touching her supplies, never disturbing her tools, never getting too close, only moving the heavier logs, clearing awkward stones, or leaving fresh firewood in tidy stacks in the quiet valley. Small kindnesses felt larger than they were on the morning they finally met. The sky was washed in a pale blue light, the kind that makes every breath feel crisp and new. Mara had risen early, determined to raise a section of the cabin wall she'd prepared the night before. The log was long, heavy, and awkward, but she believed she could manage it if she worked slowly. She tied ropes around the beam and began to lift, guiding one end upward as she braced the other against a post. Her muscles strained, her breath shortened, and her baby shifted inside her, reminding her to be careful. She paused, rubbing her belly with a gentle smile. "Just a moment," she whispered, but when she tried again, the log slipped not dangerously, just enough to make her stumble. She caught herself, but her balance wavered under the beam's weight. Before she could adjust, a firm, steady hand caught the log and lifted the burden effortlessly. "It's all right," a voice said. Low, calm, warm like sunlight on worn leather. Mara startled, turning sharply. A tall cowboy stood beside her, holding the far end of the beam as if it weighed nothing. His hat shielded most of his face, but she could see the softness in his eyes, the same kind of softness she imagined in people who had known both loneliness and peace. Her heart thumped, not in fear, but in surprise. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said gently. "You looked like you could use a hand." Her fingers loosened around the rope as she let the breath she'd been holding escape. "Thank you, I just got a little off balance," he nodded, still holding the beam. "May I help you set it in place? Then I'll be out of your way." His politeness eased her tension instantly. Mara studied him carefully. Broad shoulders, steady hands, a quietness around him that felt safe. This must be the one who'd been helping her anonymously. It made sense. He had the build of a rancher and the kind of strength that came from years of honest work. "If you don't mind," she said softly. Together they guided the beam into position. His movements were sure and respectful. He didn't crowd her or take over. He simply followed her instructions, waiting for her nods and glances before adjusting anything. When the log finally settled securely, Mara stepped back, brushing dust from her palms. "Thank you," she said again. "I really mean it." He tipped his hat. "Name's Callum. I own the ranch up on the ridge." "Mara," she replied, just Mara. A small pause stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like the space between two sentences that belonged to the same story. Callum glanced toward the pile of wood he had stacked for her in the early morning. A faint flush touched his cheeks. "I hope I haven't overstepped, leaving things to help." "I tried to keep my distance, so it was you," she said, a soft smile blooming. "I wondered. I just didn't want you to strain yourself," he admitted quietly, "but I didn't want to bother you either." "Bother?" Mara shook her head. "You've made my days easier, truly." Her gratitude warmed him more deeply than he expected. He shifted his hat again, suddenly shy. "Well, if you need anything, I'm just a ride away." Their eyes met for just a moment, too long enough for something gentle to pass between them. Trust, recognition, a quiet spark that neither fully understood yet. Then, with a small nod, he stepped back toward his horse. Mara watched him go, one hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby's soft flutter for the first time since arriving in the valley. She didn't feel quite so alone, and for the first time in a long while. Callum felt something inside him beginning to wake after their first real conversation. Something shifted between Mara and Callum subtly, naturally, as though the valley itself had been waiting for this moment. There was no rush, no dramatic confession, no grand gesture. Only a calm understanding, a shared sense of respect, and the blossoming of something quiet and wonderful. The next morning, Callum returned. He didn't ride straight into her clearing or stride up to her fire. Instead, he lingered near the edge of the pine trees, waiting until she noticed him. Mara saw him standing there, hat in hand, posture polite, and smiled in a way that made him relax instantly. "Good morning," she called. "If you're not too busy, I could use an extra pair of hands for the roof and wall frames." The invitation wasn't born of helplessness. Callum knew that she had already done more alone than most men did with a full crew. She simply recognized that some work was safer, easier, and more enjoyable when shared. And Callum, though he tried not to show it too eagerly, was grateful for the chance to spend time near her. "They began with the wall frames, Callum," held beams steady while Mara hammered nails with surprising accuracy. She was skilled in her own right, careful, focused, and unafraid of hard work. Whenever the hammer slipped or she lost her balance slightly, he was there to steady the wood or offer a quiet word of encouragement. She returned the favor with gentle conversation, asking about his ranch, his cattle, the weather patterns on the ridge. He answered in his slow, thoughtful way, choosing his words with care. Mara noticed that about him. Nothing he said was rushed. He spoke only when he meant something, and when he did, she found herself listening closely. His voice had a calmness to it that soothed her more than she expected when they lifted the first wall into place. They worked in perfect rhythm, her guiding the angle, him supporting the weight. Once the beam settled smoothly into its notch, Mara stepped back, breathing hard but smiling. "It's starting to look like a real cabin," she said. Callum glanced at her, not the structure. "A fine one, strong, just like the person building it." Her cheeks warmed, and she looked away. Pretending to inspect the log joints, compliments weren't something she was used to hearing, especially from a man who spoke them so sincerely. Yet she didn't feel embarrassed. Only seen by midday, they paused for a break. Mara ladled stew from a pot she had simmered over the fire. She served him first out of politeness, though she didn't realize how much the gesture meant to him. Callum sat across from her on a smooth log bench, eating slowly, savoring not just the food but the rare company. A soft breeze drifted through the clearing. Birds chirped in the distance, and for a moment it felt as though this small cabin site, with its half-finished walls and scattering of tools, was already a home. When the baby kicked, Mara winced and placed a hand on her belly. Callum's eyes softened instantly. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she said with a light laugh. "This little one likes to dance any time I sit still." Callum looked at her belly with a tenderness he didn't try to hide. Something inside him stirred, a wish he had never expected to feel again. Not longing for someone he'd lost, but longing for something he hoped might be possible in the future. The afternoon brought more work, raising the second wall, fitting window frames, securing crossbeams. They worked close enough for their shoulders to brush, occasionally soft, accidental touches that sent quiet warmth through both of them. By sunset, the cabin had shape, not just logs stacked together, but the outline of a life-forming. Mara looked at the structure with pride. "Thank you, Callum. I couldn't have done all this in one day without you." He shook his head gently. "You'd have done it, maybe slower, maybe harder, but you'd have done it." She met his eyes. "It was better with you here." Callum's breath caught. He lowered his gaze, both humbled and deeply moved. And as the last light of day filtered through the framing, two lives that had been quietly circling one another finally began to interlace, not by fate, not by tragedy, but by choice, effort, and shared purpose. A cabin was rising, and so was something else, something soft, steady, and full of promise. As the cabin neared completion, the work naturally slowed, but the bond between Mara and Callum only grew stronger. What began as a simple partnership for lifting beams and securing logs had become something deeper, an unspoken companionship that filled the valley with a new kind of warmth. The cabin's walls stood tall now, the roof was nearly finished, and the windows had frames that caught the sunlight in golden rectangles. It was no longer just lumber arranged into a structure. It was a promise quietly wrapping itself around both of their hearts. Callum began stopping by more often, but never without reason. Sometimes he brought extra nails or a better saw, claiming he had them just lying around. Other days he brought small things for the baby, a knitted blanket he had found in a trunk, a carved rattle he'd whittled himself, or soft cloth for swaddling. Mara always accepted these gifts with gentle gratitude, touched by the care behind each one. She also noticed something else. Callum lingered now, not just to help with the cabin, but to talk, share meals, or simply exist quietly near her. And she found she didn't mind that at all. In fact, She looked forward to the sound of his horse's hooves approaching through the grass, to the moment his shadow stretched across the clearing, bringing calm with him. One evening, after a long day of fitting the door, Callum arrived with a small wooden cradle he had built. Its edges were smooth, its corners rounded with care, and tiny carved birds perched along the headboard. He stood awkwardly in the doorway with the cradle in his arms, unsure whether he had overstepped. I made this thought maybe the little one could use it when the time comes, he said. Voice rougher than usual. Mara stared at the cradle, stunned by the tenderness it represented. Callum, it's beautiful, he shrugged lightly, though his ears tinged red beneath his hat. Had some scrap wood. Kept my hands busy, but Mara knew it was more than that. She ran her fingers along the smooth carvings and felt her heart swell, not because she needed the cradle, but because someone had cared enough to make it. Would you help me place it? She asked. They moved it inside the nearly finished cabin together, setting it near the south wall where sunlight would fall gently in the mornings. Mara stood back, imagining her baby sleeping there, wrapped in the blanket Callum had brought. The thought stirred a warmth inside her that wasn't just maternal, it was something connected to him as well as. Days turned into evenings and evenings into shared dinners. Their connection deepened with the ease of two souls who had been waiting for a place to belong. They talked about small things, weather, cattle, the valley's seasons, but beneath those conversations lay a growing comfort, a gentle affection neither dared name. Yet one afternoon, Mara was arranging shelves when she caught Callum watching her with an expression so quietly longing, so full of unspoken hope, that her breath caught for a moment. He quickly looked away, pretending to examine the window frame, but the softness in his eyes lingered in her mind for hours that night. As she sat outside the half-finished cabin with a warm blanket over her belly, she thought about him, his quiet steadiness, his kindness, the way he made the valley feel less empty. She didn't feel alone anymore, not even before her child arrived. Callum had woven himself into her days as naturally as sunlight filtered through the pines. She wondered if he knew it. She wondered if he felt the same inside her. The baby kicked as if answering, and far up on the ridge that night, Callum sat on his porch, thinking about Mara building her life, about the cradle he had made, and about how easily she had stepped into his quiet world. Neither of them said it out loud yet, but their hearts were already forming a small, gentle family, one shared moment, one warm glance, one rising hope at a time. The storm arrived without warning, rolling over the mountains like a thick blanket of gray, bringing with it the low rumble of thunder and the scent of rain. Mara had been placing the last touches inside the cabin, smoothing the blankets in the cradle and sorting the herbs she dried near the window. She paused as the wind picked up, brushing loose strands of hair from her face. The baby shifted inside her with more intensity than usual, as though sensing the change in the air. By the time the first raindrops fell, she felt the unmistakable tightening in her belly. Her breath caught. It was time. She moved to the door, steadying herself on the frame as the wind whipped against the cabin. Her contractions were still spaced apart, but strong enough to make her heartbeat quicken. She whispered to her baby, "All right, little one. We're ready." But even with her determination, she felt a flutter of uncertainty. Not fear, just the recognition that this moment was bigger than any she had faced alone. And she wasn't alone anymore. Not really. Callum, she thought of him instantly, his steady presence, his quiet strength, the way he'd been near every day, shaping her world into something warmer, safer, fuller. She stepped outside, lifting her hand to cover her brow as she looked toward the ridge. The storm blurred the view, but she knew he was somewhere out there, likely heading home. Unaware of how quickly her time had come, but she didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the faint sound of hooves cut through the rain. Mara braced herself as the figure on horseback emerged through the curtain of water. Callum rode hard toward the cabin, soaked, breathless, and in a state she had never seen him in before. Worried. He dismounted in one swift motion. "Mara," he called, his voice breaking with urgency. "I saw the storm and came to check. Are you all right?" She exhaled shakily. "The baby's coming." Everything in him stilled. His shoulders dropped. His expression softened into something tender and focused, and he stepped toward her with careful, reverent steps. "I'm here," he said simply. He helped her inside, closing the door against the wind. The cabin glowed with lamplight, warm in contrast to the storm raging outside. Callum guided her to the bed they'd prepared together, offering steady hands, calm words, and a presence that wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. Hours passed. Slow, steady, difficult, but not lonely. Not frightening. Callum stayed beside her the entire time, helping her breathe, cooling her forehead with a cloth, whispering reassurance in the soft, patient voice that had always soothed her. "You're doing so well," he murmured. "I'm right here. You're not alone." And then, just as the storm outside began to ease, a new sound filled the cabin, a small, bright cry that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Mara's eyes flooded with joyful tears as Callum placed the newborn gently in her arms. The baby was tiny, warm, perfect. She cradled the little one against her chest, overwhelmed with pure, quiet happiness. Callum watched, awe softening every line of his face. His eyes shone not with sadness from the past, but with hope for the future. He reached out hesitantly, and Mara took his hand, guiding it to the baby. "He's beautiful," Callum whispered, voice unsteady. Mara looked up at him. In his expression, she saw the truth he hadn't dared speak, the longing, the love, the dream of a family he never thought he'd find again. "Stay," she whispered. "With us." Callum's breath caught. "Are you sure?" She nodded, tired but radiant. "I want this life with you, I think. We've been building it together all along." His answer was a soft, reverent promise. "Then I'll never leave." He sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her, the baby sleeping between them. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, a new family had formed, not through tragedy, not through rescue, but through steady effort, shared days, and a love built the same way the cabin had been, log by log, day by day, heart by heart, and together. They welcomed the morning as a family for the first time.